What's up, guys? Welcome back to another edition of Weekly Fantasy Trade Targets here on the Fantasy Stock Exchange. As you can tell, I was not around last week for the video. Bush took over. Bush, thanks again for taking over. But I am back this week, and I got a pretty long one for you guys here today, especially with those fantasy football trade deadlines coming up over the next week or two. Personally, in my leagues, my trade deadline is this weekend, so I have been firing on all cylinders. Selling guys, trading for guys, depending on what kind of situation I'm in. And of course, you know, if you're in dynasty leagues, it adds a whole nother different dynamic, especially around the trade deadline. So got a pretty long show for you guys here today. So stick around and hopefully we can get you some good information. But I'm going to start off and I'm going to talk about each position one by one. So quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, and tight ends. And I'm actually going to go through, this video is going to be a little bit different than normal. So rather than going off of guys that I'm selling high and buying low on, I'm going to kind of take a look at the strength of schedule between week 14 and week 16 to kind of give you guys an idea of who you're going to want to have around for your playoff run and who you're going to want to try and trade away. So we are kind of doing a buy low, sell high. Not all the guys that I'm going to tell you to buy will be cheap, but hey, that's the nature of the beast. If you want to get into the playoffs, if you want to have success in the playoffs, and if you want to take home the championship, you're going to need to fork out some extra assets. So first and foremost, let's go over the quarterbacks. So in terms of strength of schedule between weeks 14 and 16, the top 5 quarterbacks in that 3-week period, strength of schedule-wise, is going to be number 1, Justin Herbert, number 2, Tom Brady, then Patrick Mahomes, Nick Foles, and Alex Smith. Now, obviously, 2 of these things are not like the other. Nick Foles and Alex Smith, they've been, they are desperation plays at the quarterback no matter what. No matter how good the matchup is, I would not trust either of these guys in my fantasy championship, let alone my fantasy playoffs in general. So those 2 guys you can kind of ignore on this list. Now, Justin Herbert, Tom Brady, and Pat Mahomes, those are the interesting ones. So the cheapest one on this list is going to be Tom Brady, who's got the second easiest schedule out of all 32 quarterbacks for fantasy purposes in the fantasy playoffs. He's been a little hit or miss, especially in that game against the Saints last week. He looked horrendous. I tweeted out in the middle of the game that he should consider retiring if this is how he's going to play because it was seriously that bad. But a guy like Tom Brady with the weapons that he has in Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, now Antonio Brown, Gronk, Rojo, Leonard Fournette, I mean, he's got a total arsenal. And if he's in a good matchup, there's a better chance than not he's going to finish as, at minimum, a top 8 to top 10 quarterback on the week. That's the kind of consistency that you want in your fantasy playoffs. And you definitely want a guy who's going to find a very easy matchup. Speaking of easy matchups, if you want the absolute best, if you were so cocky to the point where you think you are definitely making your Week 16 fantasy football championship, you absolutely have to go out and get Pat Mahomes. So he's got the 3rd easiest schedule out of all of the quarterbacks for weeks 14 through 16. He gets Miami in week 14 and New Orleans in week 15, which both of them are middle of the pack against quarterbacks. So, Pat Mahomes will be perfectly fine. But if you make the championship with Pat Mahomes, he's going to get you 1 billion points because he gets to go against the Atlanta Falcons in fantasy championship weekend. Now, I'll touch base on the Kansas City Chiefs and the other positions a little down the road, but I cannot stress this enough. Pat Mahomes needs to be on your team if you are that confident that you are going to make the championship. He is going to be by far one of the more expensive guys on this entire list. He is going to be absolutely impossible to get if the owner in your league is currently also a playoff spot. But if someone is actively selling, maybe it's a keeper league, maybe it's a dynasty league, maybe they're rebuilding or whatever, this is the perfect time to try and get Pat Mahomes. Like I said, he's going to be expensive, but he gives you a better chance, in my opinion, than anyone else to take home that fantasy football championship at that quarterback position. So I would definitely do your due diligence, see what the situation is for the Pat Mahomes owner currently in your league, and make an assessment based off of that. I personally went out last night in my dynasty league. I traded an arm and a leg to get Pat Mahomes, but currently I'm leading my division, and I've got a knock on wood, a fairly easy schedule ahead of me between now and the fantasy playoffs. And the only thing that I was really missing was a legitimate quarterback. So I went out, got Pat Mahomes, and I'll let you guys know after week 16 if it paid off or not. And then I mentioned Justin Herbert at the very beginning. Justin Herbert's been fantastic. He's been a top 10 quarterback pretty much every single week since he's taken over. If it's a positive matchup, he's got immediate top 5 upside on the week, and he's going to have that all throughout the playoffs. I mean, he is the #1 fantasy quarterback in terms of strength of schedule for those playoff weeks. Now, Justin Herbert is probably going to be more expensive than Tom Brady is right now, but that's okay because you got to risk it for the biscuit. You got to fork out the big money where big money is due, and big money is due to Justin Herbert if you're going to try and buy him. Again, trading at the trade deadline in a redraft league, it's a bit harder because you can't give away your future picks. You can't give away your young assets for immediate production now. In redraft leagues, you really got to balance everything out. See, okay, is this person still in it? If so, what can I give them from my roster so that I can get what I want in return? Or, unfortunately, if you're just in a league where people completely bail out once they're out of the playoffs, I'm not advising on collusion, but unfortunately, it's going to take collusion to get these guys off the team. So unfortunately, there are some leagues where it's just not going to be possible based on the dynamic of your league. But those 3 quarterbacks, Tom Brady, Justin Herbert, and Pat Mahomes, are absolute must-have for the fantasy playoffs if you can get them. I do have a couple honorable mentions and a couple sells for every single category. Like I said, it's going to be a long video. But my honorable mentions for this are going to be Lamar Jackson. So Lamar Jackson has been disappointing, to say the least, in fantasy this year. I mean, he's had himself a couple big games here and there, a couple disappointing games, but for the most part, he's been pretty average. We kind of expected that we would have to rely on his rushing ability for fantasy points, but I don't think we realized how bad his passing output would be going into week 10 of the entire season. But Lamar Jackson does have a fairly easy playoff schedule. I believe he's like number 8 or number 9 in terms of strength of schedule over those 3 weeks. And, you know, if the Ravens are making their playoff push, Lamar Jackson's going to show up. He's going to do whatever he needs to do to get the team those wins. And that means that he's going to do whatever it takes to get your fantasy team those wins. He's a guy that I'd be very excited to have going into the fantasy playoffs. And the cool thing is, he's not nearly as expensive as Pat Mahomes or Justin Herbert. You could probably get him for around what you would have to pay to get Tom Brady, in my opinion, unless it's a dynasty league. Again, changes the whole dynamic. But since Jackson has been fairly disappointing up to this point, and his schedule leading up to the playoffs isn't exactly the most favorable, you might be able to get him for a pretty cheap price for your playoffs. Next honorable mentions are Ryan Tannehill, Aaron Rodgers, and Carson Wentz. All 3 of these guys are also in the top 12, top 15 strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs. And all of these guys have known to have a pretty good fantasy day here and there. I mean, Ryan Tannehill, he's not the most consistent out of these guys, so he's probably the last person on my honorable mentions list that I would actually go out and get, but he's probably the cheapest option as well. Aaron Rodgers, he's got himself a pretty decent schedule. It's not amazing. It's not a top 5 schedule, but it's Aaron Rodgers. You know, he's got Devontae Adams. He's got Aaron Jones. Between those 2 guys, you know Aaron Rodgers is going to put up at least 20 points in any matchup. So Aaron Rodgers, weeks 14 through 16, it's actually Detroit, Carolina, and Tennessee. So actually all 3 of those are pretty good matchups. Tennessee is hit or miss when it comes to defense. Sometimes they decide to show up. Sometimes they don't. Carolina's secondary has been performing pretty well. I mean, better than we expected. And then Detroit is Detroit, and Aaron Rodgers knows how to exploit them. But either way, Aaron Rodgers could have himself a fantastic 3 games in the fantasy playoffs. And then we have Carson Wentz, who his schedule is New Orleans, Arizona, and Dallas. New Orleans and Arizona are middling at best, but that matchup against Dallas in your fantasy championship, that's what you would target Carson Wentz for. So there you have it. Lamar Jackson, Ryan Tannehill, Aaron Rodgers, and Carson Wentz are going to be my honorable mentions at the quarterback position. And then I have 3 guys to sell high on right now at the quarterback position. Get them off your team. Try to get one of the last guys that I talked about. If you can manage to get Herbert, Brady, or Mahomes for one of these guys, that's fantastic. I honestly think you might be able to based on 1 or 2 of these names. But I am selling Deshaun Watson, Tua Tagovailoa, and Josh Allen. Again, don't sell Tua in a dynasty league. It's again, there's so many dynamics, but this is primarily focused on redraft or even short-term keeper, whatever. But Deshaun Watson has the most miserable fantasy playoff schedule for any quarterback in the entire league. He's got Chicago and Indianapolis in weeks 14 and 15. Somehow, if you make the fantasy championship after those two, and both of those matchups, I'm pretty sure Chicago and Indianapolis are allowing the bottom two. Each are allowing the bottom two amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. Actually, right here, the Colts are allowing 15.2 on average points to the quarterback position, and the Bears are not far behind, averaging out 15.5 points for the opposing quarterbacks. So Deshaun Watson, I don't have a lot of hope for him in weeks 14 and 15. Week 16, he does get the Cincinnati Bengals, who are middling and could be a good matchup, but it's going to be hard to actually make the championship with Deshaun Watson on your playoff roster. Next up is Tua. He's got the third hardest schedule out of anyone. Kansas City and New England in weeks 14 and 15. Again, he's a guy, he'll reward you in week 16 if you actually make it to the championship with a matchup against Vegas. But Kansas City and New England is not something that I want to even mess around with, especially for a rookie quarterback in the fantasy playoffs. I'm staying away from that. And if people are so high on Tua, because I know recency bias is a hell of a drug, and he had himself a pretty decent week 9, I would sell Tua immediately. And then the last sell high I have on here is going to be Josh Allen. He has a bottom 5 schedule for fantasy quarterbacks. Buffalo gets Pittsburgh, Denver, and New England in their fantasy playoffs. Obviously, Pittsburgh and New England in weeks 14 and 16 are the dreaded matchups here. It's not going to get easier for Josh Allen. You know, he's already shown that he can have a bad game here or there. You know, he had a couple weeks in a row. And I don't want to play with him. I want to play the matchup. And I sure as hell don't want to play him against Pittsburgh. And I really don't want to play him against New England, despite them being, you know, not nearly as good as they were last year on defense. But yeah, so that's going to be all the quarterbacks that I have for you here today on the trade targets. Next up, we have the running backs. Top 5 strength of schedule for the playoffs. We have Derrick Henry, who is absolutely elite. We have Aaron Jones, who is absolutely elite. And then we have our question marks with the next, with the 3, 4, and 5 best playoff schedules. And that's going to be David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears, DeAndre Swift of the Detroit Lions, and then, of course, the tandem of Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette down there in Tampa. I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to be almost impossible for you to get Derrick Henry or Aaron Jones at the trade deadline unless the person you are dealing with is far out of playoff contention, because you don't just trade Derrick Henry and Aaron Jones during crunch time, but you definitely want to trade for Derrick Henry and Aaron Jones in crunch time. So if it can be done, you have to explore the option, because both of those guys, they are both going to be top 5 running backs for the fantasy playoffs. They are going to award anyone who has them greatly. Like Aaron Jones is going to have Detroit, Carolina, and Tennessee, as I mentioned before. Detroit and Carolina are abysmal against the run. Tennessee has been middling on a good day against the run. And then we have Derrick Henry going against Jacksonville, terrible. Detroit, terrible. Green Bay, middling. So either of these guys, they're going to probably get you a fantasy championship. But you have David Montgomery, who's a pretty intriguing option. So David Montgomery, he is entirely matchup based. You know, he's got a very safe floor week in and week out, especially in PPR leagues, getting you those 10 to 12 points. But if he finds the end zone in any given week, he's actually performing as a pretty decent running back. And I have faith that he can do that weeks 14 through 16, I think, in all 3 of the matchups. So he's got Houston, abysmal against the run, Minnesota, abysmal against the run, and Jacksonville, who is also not good against the run. That's 3 games in a row in the fantasy playoffs where David Montgomery could actually show up and show out. He's not going to be nearly as expensive as Derrick Henry and Aaron Jones, especially he is currently in the concussion protocol. He hasn't done anything spectacular this season. There's really not a lot of long-term appeal with David Montgomery. And out of all of these guys, I think he's going to be the cheapest one, and he could actually be a very, very sneaky and safe RB2 for your playoffs. So I never thought I'd tell anyone to actually go out there and buy David Montgomery at any point in the 2020 season. But if you're in need of a bench running back or a flex guy or even an RB2, if you're having some unlucky stuff going on and you're getting injuries or what have you, David Montgomery is a pretty cheap option to get at the fantasy trade deadline. Next up, DeAndre Swift. The Detroit Lions are going to have Green Bay, Tennessee, and Tampa Bay. Obviously, Tampa Bay is far from ideal for the fantasy running backs, but the first two really aren't too bad. And DeAndre Swift he's slowly turning into a PPR monster. You know, he's got a pretty safe floor when it comes to his targets. Plus, he's been a very efficient runner on the ground. And these are honestly games where Detroit's probably going to be playing catch up, and they're going to want to be playing spoiler, especially with the real life playoffs ahead. So I'd expect DeAndre Swift to be pretty heavily involved in these ones. Dynasty and keeper leagues, he's going to be a bit tougher to get, but in those redraft leagues, again, aside from 1 or 2 weeks, he really hasn't done anything spectacular, so he shouldn't be too expensive for you. And then Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette, even though they're top 5 in strength of schedule, I'm staying away from both of them. We don't know what's going on. 1 week it's Leonard Fournette, 1 week it's kind of Ronald Jones. But most of the time, it's just neither of them, and I don't want either of them on my team. I don't care how good the matchup is, unless one of them gets hurt, which, God forbid, I don't pray that anyone gets hurt, but unless one of them gets hurt, neither one of them really has any appeal. So I'm going to completely ignore them. I do have 4 honorable mentions. First one's going to be Austin Eckler, he should be back from the injury reserve list, either week 12 or week 13. Nothing's set in stone, but there's a really, really, really solid chance that he's going to be back and ready to perform for the fantasy playoffs. He's been injured for weeks now. He's still going to be injured for at least another 1 to 3 weeks. A lot of people have kind of forgot about him, but I haven't. He had over 300 PPR points last year. And I don't know if you noticed, but the Chargers have not had a lot of luck with their running game since Austin Eckler went out. Justin Jackson's looked decent here and there, but he's always hurt. Josh Kelly has kind of faded away, and then they just have a whole project of other running backs going on. And I think they're going to be really relieved when they get Austin Eckler back. And as long as he's fully healthy, he's going to be slotted back in immediately to his typical role. And I got to remind you that before he left the season with injury, I think it was back in week 2 or week 3, he managed to put up back-to-back games where 1 week he had 18 and the next week he had over 30 PPR points. So he's a very sneaky buy right now that nobody's talking about for the fantasy playoffs. Next up is Nick Chubb. He should be coming back from injury this week. He's probably going to be the toughest buy out of my honorable mentions, but he's got himself a pretty solid schedule. Cleveland has Baltimore, the Giants, and then the Jets. Obviously, Baltimore is not ideal, but back-to-back games in weeks 15 and week 16 against both of the abysmal New York teams. I mean, who wouldn't want Nick Chubb in either of those matchups? So he's definitely a guy to look at as well. Then I have Todd Gurley and Myles Gaskin. Now, the thing with Todd Gurley, believe it or not, he's currently the RB6 on the season in PPR leagues. I called him to be an RB1 ahead of this season, and Bush and oh my gosh, you guys, everyone here at Fantasy Stock Exchange called me crazy. I got ragged on so much, especially after I dropped an article about Todd Gurley. And it's not sexy. It's not pretty. He's not consistent, but he is an RB1 right now, and he's actually been performing pretty well. Atlanta, over the last 3 weeks of the season, they get the Chargers, Tampa Bay, and Kansas City. Tampa Bay in week 15 is obviously cause for concern, but the Chiefs have been decent, but not too punishing on the running backs. And then that first week matchup against the Chargers, I mean, Todd Gurley can go out and single-handedly get you to the next round in your fantasy playoffs. So he might be a little more expensive than I'd be comfortable with paying for him. And that might happen to you too. So he's very loosely an honorable mention on this list, but nonetheless, I felt like I had to include him on here because he does only have one really bad matchup in the fantasy playoffs. And then the last one's going to be Myles Gaskin. So Miami, as I mentioned before with Tua, they get Kansas City, New England, and Las Vegas. Again, Kansas City is middling, slightly above average against the run. New England is kind of the same. But Myles Gaskin is a guy, you're not going to need to slot him into your lineup in weeks 14 and 15 because he's currently hurt. He's not spectacular. He's kind of just a floor play, especially in PPR leagues on any given week. I guarantee you the guy that has Myles Gaskin in your league is not going to ask for the world for an injured Myles Gaskin. If you can get him and just stash him away if you make your fantasy championship in week 16, Las Vegas is a phenomenal matchup to have. And Myles Gaskin he's shown over the course of this season that he's really the only competent running back there in Miami. So I assume that as soon as he gets back, he'll run away with the starting job once again. He's an honorable mention, like I said, primarily because he's going to be so damn cheap ahead of the trade deadline for you. And use the fact that he's injured right now as some leverage. And then, of course, I have my sell highs at the running back position. Ezekiel Elliott is my number one sell high. He's been miserable without Dak. He has the absolute worst schedule out of all the fantasy running backs out there, like the absolute worst schedule. And he has not done a damn thing over the last few weeks. If you can sell him based off of name alone, I 1,000% would. I would flip Zeke straight up for Austin Eckler or Nick Chubb right now if somebody's willing to do that. It's rough out there for Zeke, and you got to get him off your team. Next up, I'm also going to try to sell high. I'm going to try to sell high on the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs running backs. So they're also both in bottom three in terms of strength of schedule, and they're both in committees. You know, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, and then Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Le'Veon Bell. All four of them, who knows who's doing what? I mean, honestly, at this point, Zach Moss has been the most safe running back over the last couple of weeks out of all four of these. And even that, like, I don't want Zach Moss. Out of all four of these, he's my least favorite one, especially based off of name, talent, and everything that we've seen in the past. So if you can get anything for these guys, I would try and trade them immediately and try to see what kind of return you can get. And then I'm also going to trade away David and Duke Johnson from the Houston Texans. Don't know if there's much of a market for Duke Johnson right now, but David Johnson has done well enough this season to kind of warrant as a back-end RB2 status. You might be able to sell that. And honestly, if you could sell him and get the return of even Myles Gaskin straight up, I would 100%, because that matchup for Myles Gaskin in the fantasy championship is going to make a big difference. And personally, I don't think David Johnson's going to do much in his matchups. I mean, he's got Chicago, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati. It's not fun at all for him, and you're not going to be able to use him in any of those except for that Week 16 matchup. And as I was saying, I'd rather have Myles Gaskin in his Week 16 matchup. So see if anyone's willing to buy on those guys right now. It's not a given. All of them except for Ezekiel Elliott really don't offer much in name. I mean, Clyde Edwards did until Le'Veon Bell came in and signed. So we'll see what happens. Again, I have to keep mentioning this. It depends on the type of league you're in. It depends on the dynamic. It depends if it's a keeper league, if it's a dynasty league, if it's a redraft league, whatever it is. So keep all of this in mind. I'm trying to put in kind of like a healthy mix of everything. If you're in a dynasty league, don't go out and sell Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I don't think I need to tell you that, but I'm going to remind you just because I don't want anyone coming back and say, oh, this asshole's telling me to get rid of Clyde Edwards-Helaire right now. No, I'm not telling you to do that. But if you are in a redraft league or a short-term keeper league, not a bad idea if you can bolster your team elsewhere ahead of the playoffs. So then move on to the wide receivers and the top five strength of schedule. Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, those guys are obviously both phenomenal. You don't need me to tell you how good they are because they are both consistently putting up points in fantasy football. I mean, the Rams have been hit or miss occasionally, but in good matchups, their offense has been firing on all cylinders. And they have New England in Week 14, which is less than stellar. But then they get the Jets and Seattle, and the Jets and Seattle have been two of the worst teams against the fantasy receivers in the entire league. So more than happy to play one of them if I have to against New England, if it means I get to use them the next 2 weeks. Next up is going to be Jamison Crowder, who is probably my favorite buy low on this list because you genuinely can buy him low. I actually made a couple of sell high trades yesterday in one of my keeper leagues, and I had an empty roster spot, went out on the waiver wire. Jamison Crowder was just chilling there. This is a keeper league that we've had this is our 8th season now, and Jamison Crowder was just sitting there, and he only has about 70% ownership right now in Yahoo. But when he plays, he is on fire. He's so consistent. He's guaranteed to get you 2 points, especially or double-digit points, especially in those PPR leagues. He finds the end zone. He's going to get you over 20 points for the week. I mean, Jamison Crowder is a fantastic receiver to have, and absolutely nobody talks about it. The New York Jets playoff schedule, he gets Seattle in the first week, so that's a massive bonus to have to start your fantasy playoffs. Then he gets the Rams. Probably see a lot of Jalen Ramsey, but Crowder is still a safe option even in a tough matchup. So you can play him in a pinch in that flex position. And then week 16, he gets the Cleveland Browns, who really haven't done a whole hell of a lot against the receiver this year either. So he's going to be my favorite buy low. He might even be out there on your waiver wires, especially since the Jets are on a bye this week. So if you can grab him and stash him for your playoffs, 1,000% would. Next up is going to be Terry McLaurin with the third easiest strength of schedule for fantasy receivers. He's going to be very difficult to get because on this entire list, he's arguably been the best, but he's also one of the league's best kept secrets. I am more into dynasty and keeper league football than I am in redraft. But even on all of the Twitter pages that I follow that focus primarily on dynasty, Terry McLaurin is still not getting the value that he deserves. And it's because he doesn't have the same name as DK Metcalf or A.J. Brown or even the new rookies like C.D. Lamb and Justin Jefferson. And Terry McLaurin is on an abysmal football team in Washington. But like I said, his value does not match where it should be. His strength of schedule is fantastic. He gets San Francisco, who is pretty decent at locking down the number one receiver. But Terry McLaurin has proven many times this season that he's perfectly fine against the number one corners. Then week 15, he's got a matchup with Seattle, who are a bottom two team in terms of fantasy points against the receivers. And then he's got Carolina in week 16, which, speaking as a Carolina fan, Terry McLaurin is going to run all over them. He's a guy that I'd be very excited to have in my fantasy playoffs. I think you should be trying to go out and get him if you can. Again, his value has been rising, so God only knows if he's actually available in trades right now, but hey, see what you can do. Next up, I got those Bucs receivers. I mentioned earlier that the Bucs have, I think the Bucs might be the only one that have a position or that have a mention on all four of the main positions in fantasy football. They have a stellar end of season schedule for the fantasy playoffs. I mean, it's fantastic. So Chris Godwin has been underwhelming and injured this year. Mike Evans has just been underwhelming in general. And then Antonio Brown, we still don't know what to expect from him, but he did look pretty damn good in his first game in Tampa, despite Tom Brady showing out a complete dud of a game. So I would see if you can get any three of these guys, because I think all three of them are safe bets to, fulfill a double-digit PPR floor. And in those matchups that they do have, any one of them, any two of them, or even all three of them could completely go off at any given time. I really like the matchups that they're going to be a part of. And then the fifth best strength schedule wide receiver, who is my absolute favorite target right now, arguably in any format, is Allen Robinson. He's so underappreciated. He is not taken seriously by the fantasy football community. I swear. He's so good. He's so consistent. Go look at his points per game right now. He's scoring you somewhere between 14 and 17 PPR points at minimum every single game. He's only had one dud this entire season. He's gone off a couple of times, and he's doing it all with Nick Foles throwing him the ball. And no offense to Nick Foles, but this is not a great situation for Allen Robinson to be in, but he's still making the most of it. In plus matchups, he's been especially great. And his matchups are Houston, Minnesota, and Jacksonville. And none of those teams are going to be able to shut down Allen Robinson. I would not be the least bit surprised if Allen Robinson is the number one overall scoring receiver in the fantasy playoffs. And you got to get him. He's going to be expensive, but he's not going to be as expensive as he should be. He's currently the wide receiver 9 on the season, has completely shown up, shown out, been consistent. You got to get him on your team. Do whatever you can do. And then I have my honorable mentions at the wide receiver position. First one is going to be arguably impossible to get in a trade unless you figure some kind of crazy thing out. That's going to be Tyreek Hill. He's got Pat Mahomes throwing in the ball. As I mentioned earlier, they have a cakewalk of 3 matchups over weeks 14 and 16. Tyreek Hill is going to keep Tyreek Hilling that's a no-brainer. See if you can get him. Again, you're not going to be able to get Tyreek Hill if the guy who has him is a playoff contender right now. But if the person that has him is a seller or rebuilding in dynasty or what have you, take a look. See if you can grab him, because he's going to have a phenomenal fantasy playoffs. Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals is another honorable mention that I have. So they get Dallas, Pittsburgh, and Houston. Obviously, Pittsburgh is not a fantastic matchup, but Dallas and Houston, I mean, Tyler Boyd's going to eat them absolutely alive. He's another guy like Allen Robinson. He's so underappreciated. He's not talked about enough, but he's very safe, and in plus matchups, he has every capability to completely go off. Plus, you pair that with the fact that he is Joe Burrow's #1 favorite target, and that's a recipe for pure bliss. So Tyler Boyd's another guy that I'm trying to go out there and get. Next up, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams. As I mentioned with Justin Herbert has the easiest schedule out of all the fantasy quarterbacks, which means that Mike Williams and Keenan Allen are going to be massive beneficiaries. Mike Williams is going to be significantly cheaper than Keenan Allen, so I would lean him, but I would be remiss not to mention both of them here in the honorable mention portion of the wide receivers. And then my last honorable mention is a guy who's completely broken out over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and he has been so consistent. He's been basically a top 10 receiver in terms of points per game since breaking out and finally getting a spot on that Philadelphia Eagles offense, and that's going to be Travis Fulgham. So Philly in the playoffs, New Orleans, Arizona, Dallas, again, 2 middling matchups, and then Dallas in week 16. I mean, that is the definition of a league winner. If you can get to the championship, Travis Fulgham's going to have himself a day and a half against Dallas. I don't care who's healthy for the Eagles that day. As long as Travis Fulgham and Carson Wentz are healthy in week 16, I don't care who else is on the field. Travis Fulgham's going to see a massive target share. It's going to be a very important game to win the division. He's going to be firing on all cylinders. Carson Wentz is going to be looking his way early and often. And he is. There's not many receivers out there that I could buy this low that I would rather have than Travis Fulgham. So see what you can do. Go out and get him as well. And then obviously I got my sell highs here for the receivers. I'm selling high on my Carolina receivers. DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, even Curtis Samuel, since he's broken out the last couple of weeks. I want nothing to do with them in the fantasy playoffs. And it really sucks because I have a lot of stock in DJ Moore right now, and he's been total shit show this year. But Carolina this year, they get Denver, which is not bad, Green Bay, and Washington. I really don't want either of these guys against Green Bay and Washington, especially in a matchup that's in Green Bay in the middle of December. It's just there's something about Lambeau that really messes with opposing teams, especially in the cold. So I want nothing to do with it. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's just I can see the future. I don't know. But DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, with the exception of that matchup with Denver in Week 14, there's really nothing special about their playoffs. You can sell DJ Moore off of name alone and sell Robbie Anderson's production over the course of 2020. 1,000% would. I have 2 other tandems of receivers that I'm trying to sell right now. I mentioned earlier, Deshaun Watson has an absolutely miserable schedule. So obviously I'm going to be selling Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller. Will Fuller is that boomer bust play that everyone looks to have on their roster. And Brandon Cooks has actually shown up and shown out for the last 3 or 4 weeks in a row now. You can get anything for these guys. I 1,000% would take it because I can't see me using any of them in any of their matchups for the fantasy playoffs. And the last one's going to be a little surprising, but I got to bring up Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings. They have Tampa Bay in Week 14, Chicago in Week 15, and New Orleans in Week 16. I don't mind the matchup in New Orleans so much, but Tampa Bay and Chicago, that's something I want to avoid. I mean, granted, we know Tampa Bay's secondary isn't phenomenal. Chicago's has been pretty damn good this year. But we know Tampa Bay's isn't phenomenal, but there's just something really to dislike about those 2 games in Week 14 and Week 15. Plus, you pair that with the fact that Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, both of them based on name alone and the production that they've had here in 2020, they can yield you something pretty stellar. I couldn't even begin to tell you what the value is on them because, again, every league is different depending on the dynamic, just depending on your league mates or what have you. But if you have either of these guys, I'd put them on the trade block and see what kind of offers you accumulate because I genuinely think there are a lot of better options, especially at the receiver position for your fantasy playoffs. And the last position that we have to talk about here today is going to be the tight end position. Obviously, starting at number 1, strength of schedule, we're going to completely ignore him because I don't want him, you don't want him. Tyler Eifert, get out of here, total waste. Same thing with number 2. I feel bad saying this, but Greg Olsen, I don't want him on my fantasy playoff team. I'm a massive Carolina Panthers fan. It broke my heart when Greg Olsen signed with Seattle and got released by Carolina. But hey, this is fantasy. We're trying to win here. I don't care how good the schedule is. Greg Olsen is not consistent enough to get you that win. Now the third guy, however, as I mentioned, Tampa Bay, they've got a guy here in every single category, and Gronk could arguably be, with the exception of Travis Kelce, Gronk could probably be the number 1 scoring fantasy tight end over those playoff weeks. As I mentioned, the matchups are so easy. Brady has been connecting with Gronk a lot more. I mean, granted, last week Gronk had 1 catch for 6 yards, I believe, off the top of my head. But, I mean, it was just a bad game for the Bucs and Brady in general. They're going to rebound. They're going to rebound immediately against Carolina this weekend. Then they get to come in. Gronk gets to go against Minnesota, Atlanta, and Detroit. I mean, he's going to eat all 3 of them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's going to be very exciting to be the Gronk owner in your fantasy playoffs. Even if he only catches 4 or 5 balls in each of those weeks, I can almost guarantee he's going to find the end zone in at least 2 of those weeks. So I think it's going to be a very exciting fantasy playoffs, getting to watch Gronk do his thing out there. The next, I have 3 more guys because the 5th one are the Minnesota Vikings. Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith, I don't want either of them on my playoff teams. But Jimmy Graham at number 4 for strength of schedule in the tight ends, I do want him. So Chicago, again, they have a stellar week 14 through 16 schedule. Phenomenal. And Jimmy Graham has been fairly safe. You know, he's been getting his 6 to 9 targets every single game. Nick Foles trusts him. He's a big red zone target. There's not really a lot to dislike about Jimmy Graham this year. I mean, he has been one of fantasy's biggest surprises, especially at the tight end position, which is obviously a position that has been lacking for many, many years. It's refreshing to see Jimmy Graham come out here and kind of showcase some of his old ability. I'm not going to say he's going to be a complete league winner, but he is the perfect tight end to go in and buy very low ahead of the trade deadline, especially if you're very needy at the tight end position, or if you have one of these next few guys that I'm going to mention. Jimmy Graham is going to be a guy that you're going to want to target in your trades. So I know I go right from here to the honorable mentions, but since I was talking about the next guys, I'm going to bring up the sells before the honorable mentions. Guys that I'm selling high on right now, Mike Gesicki, absolutely miserable schedule coming up, and he has been far less than consistent. Don't know how much you're going to get from him in a trade, but you might be able to get something just based off of name alone and the hype that comes with him having Tua throwing the ball. Next up is Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee. Again, don't know how much you're going to get for these guys, but Tyler Higbee had a great deal of hype at one point. Gerald Everett had a great deal of hype at one point as well. Maybe you can get something for one of these guys. I wouldn't count on it, but throw them out in the trade block, see what you can get. And then my biggest sell high for the tight end position actually kind of breaks my heart, but it's Jonnu Smith of the Tennessee Titans. I don't like his week 15. I don't like his week 16. Again, Tennessee gets Detroit and Green Bay, who have actually been fairly decent at shutting down the tight end position. And Jonnu Smith, I mean, the last few games, he's only been getting 2, 3, maybe 4 targets if he's lucky. He is – I mean, it sucks to say because I was so high on Jonnu Smith, but he's kind of become the definition of a touchdown-dependent tight end week in and week out. Now, don't get me wrong, he is one of the safer bets to actually find the end zone out of a lot of tight ends in the league. But I don't want to depend on that in fantasy playoffs, and especially in negative matchups. I can't put my eggs in those baskets. Jonnu Smith, he is, I believe, a top 7 or top 8 tight end right now in PPR. I think he has around 90 points on the year. He's doing perfectly fine. I think you could sell him. I don't know if I would sell him straight up for Jimmy Graham per se, but I think you could get Jimmy Graham and an extra piece for Jonnu Smith, because a lot of people are starting to put Jonnu Smith on a pedestal, I guess you could say, because the hype has kind of resurfaced, especially with him finding the end zone recently. Let's see what you can do. Jonnu Smith is probably your best bet out of this entire tight end sell list to actually yield you something in return. And then I have my honorable mentions at the tight end position. I'm going to mention Travis Kelce. You're not going to get him in a trade. Unless you pull off some Houdini type shit, you're not going to get him in a trade. But I had to mention him because he's Travis Kelce. He's phenomenal. I literally have in my show notes here, Travis Kelce, and then in parentheses, good luck. So good luck. Eric Ebron is a great buy low target ahead of the trade deadline as an honorable mention. So Pittsburgh gets Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. I like the matchups with Buffalo and Cincinnati in weeks 14 and 15. Not stoked about the one in Indianapolis because Indianapolis is, I think they're either the number 1 or the number 2 in terms of shutting down opposing tight ends. So you probably won't be able to use Eric Ebron in week 16, but he could be a great streaming option for you over the first 2 weeks of your fantasy playoff. Next up, Jared Cook of the New Orleans Saints. Never thought I'd say this because I've always been significantly lower than the consensus on Jared Cook, but he's got games against Philly, Kansas City, and Minnesota. That week 15 against Kansas City is not something I'm super pumped about, but Philly and Minnesota has been middling at best against the tight end, and actually Minnesota has been just downright dreadful on defense in general this year. So I think Jared Cook could be a very sneaky streaming option for weeks 14 and 16, and I don't really think he's going to be very expensive to get. He hasn't done a whole hell of a lot this year. I mean, I think he's had 1 or 2 pretty good games, but for the most part, I mean, he's been fairly underwhelming. I don't even think he is a tight end 1 on the season right now. So I would look into potentially grabbing him for your weeks 14 and 16 matchups. Then, of course, I got to mention Hunter Henry. Mentioned it earlier, Justin Herbert, easiest schedule for all fantasy quarterbacks out there this year. And Hunter Henry, much like Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, is going to be a direct beneficiary of that. So I know I put a lot of information into this video. I know I didn't get to put a lot of stats in there like I usually do, but if I put stats in here, this video would have been 3 hours long. If you had any questions on these guys whatsoever, feel free to follow me on Twitter at ff_Mikey10. I always follow back, and you can shoot me a DM. I will gladly explain myself a little bit more on these. But with the trade deadline coming up, everything, you need everything now. You know, my trade deadline in almost all of my leagues is this Saturday. I'm exploring trade options, whether I'm selling, whether I'm buying, I'm doing whatever I can. And I wanted to get you guys as much possible information in a little amount of time as I could to give you the opportunity to go out there and make those trades. If you are searching for a playoff spot still, good luck. If you've already clinched a spot, hell yeah, that's fantastic after 9 weeks. Unfortunately, if you're someone who's way out of playoff contention, this is my reminder to you. Don't ruin the league for everyone else. Don't go trading away Alvin Kamara for Cole Beasley straight up or something ridiculous like that. Nobody likes that person in the league that goes out and colludes and ruins the league. So don't be that guy. With that being said, if you have that guy in your league and you know that he's going to do it, fair is fair. Get to him first. But in all seriousness, no, good luck, everyone, in the coming weeks. I will be back next week, and next week's going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be a typical trade targets. I think I'm going to talk about quarterbacks, kickers, and defenses to go ahead and stash for those playoff matchups because you really only stream kickers, defense, and if you don't have an elite quarterback, you're probably going to stream that too between weeks 14 and 16, especially in a one-quarterback redraft league. But for myself, for Fantasy Stock Exchange, and for the Trade Target show that we ran this year, it's been a hell of a lot of fun. I'm excited to figure out what my next video series is going to be because obviously once the trade deadline passes, these videos will have no value anymore because you can't actually make the trades. But looking forward to see what comes next. Feel free to follow myself on Twitter, as I mentioned before. Follow Fantasy Stock Exchange, and if you aren't already, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and comment below with any questions, comments, concerns. If you want to just tell me I'm a goofy-looking dude, that's fine too. You know, that's on you. But thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you all next week, and good luck in those Week 10 matchups.